Hey, my name is Bill, and I joked about driving to the coast. I'm 40, I live alone in the mountains, and my neighbor Charlotte and I had this quiet routine of coffee on the porch every morning. I said it to fill a silence, the kind of thing you blurt out when the quiet has gone on too long. But Charlotte said okay before I even finished the sentence, fast and sure, like she'd been waiting for someone to say those words. And something in her eyes told me this trip was never about the ocean. Let me take you back to before Charlotte. Back to what my life looked like when the most exciting part of my day was whether the coffee was hot enough. I wake up at 5 every morning without an alarm because my body just knows, the way a farmer's body knows, the way a man who's lived alone long enough just grows into the rhythm of the hours. I put the kettle on, I let Rufus out the back door, and I stand on the porch while the fog sits heavy on the mountains and the birds start up their noise. The coffee is black, no sugar, the same way I've drunk it for 30 years. Rufus is an old hound I found behind the hardware store 6 years ago, ribs showing, too tired to run, and he followed me home and he never left. He's gray around the muzzle now, and he moves slow, but he's good company for a man who doesn't need much conversation. I build things for a living. Tables and chairs and shelves and cabinets, working out of a shop behind my house that used to be a carriage barn, with old wood walls and a concrete floor, and the whole place smelling like pine and sawdust and the mineral oil I rub into the grain. People in town call me when a door won't hang right, when a fence needs mending, when a kitchen cabinet has a sag. I show up, I fix it, I go home. It's honest work, and busy hands are the only thing I've found that keeps the quiet from getting too loud. My wife, Linda, left 3 years ago. She said the silence was eating her alive, that I was a good man, but a quiet one, and that quiet isn't the same as peace. She packed a single suitcase on a Thursday afternoon while I was in the shop, and when I came inside for lunch, the car was gone, and there was a note on the counter that said she was sorry and she needed more than this town could give her. She went to Richmond, and I know that because the divorce papers came 6 months later with a Richmond return address. I signed them, and I mailed them back, and I didn't fight it, because somewhere deep down, I knew she was right. This town, this house, this life, it wasn't enough for her. And I thought that meant I wasn't enough either. The house still has her fingerprints. The curtain rods she picked out are still in the bedroom window, and the kitchen tiles she chose, blue with white edges, still catch the morning light the same way. There's a hook by the front door where her coat used to hang, and I've never hung anything else there because it doesn't feel right. I eat my dinners at the small table in the kitchen, the one she used to call the breakfast nook, and I read the local paper, and I feed Rufus scraps under the table, even though I know I shouldn't. The house is clean, and it's quiet, and it's mine. But sometimes it feels like a museum of a life that doesn't exist anymore. I've gotten used to it, the eating alone and the sleeping alone, and the long evenings where the only sound is Rufus breathing on the rug and the radio playing old country songs low enough to be company without being noise. I'm not unhappy, and I want to be clear about that. I've settled into the solitude the way a man settles into a chair that isn't comfortable but fits the shape of his body. It's not a life I would have chosen, but it's the one I have, and I'd stopped wishing for different. I thought that was the end of my story, just a man and his dog and his workshop filling the years with sawdust and routine until the years ran out. But sometimes, on the porch with my coffee, watching the fog lift off the ridge and the light come through the trees in long golden bars, I feel something shift in my chest. It's faint, like a window someone has cracked open an inch. Not a breeze, just the suggestion of one. The feeling that there might be something else out there, something warm, something I haven't let myself want in a long time. And then Rufus nudges my hand with his nose, and I scratch his ears, and I finish my coffee, and I go to work. And the window closes again, gentle as it opened. The house across the gravel driveway had been empty for almost a year. The previous owners were an older couple who moved to be closer to their daughter in Roanoke, and the house sat there with its blinds drawn and its grass growing too long, looking like it was holding its breath. Then, one Wednesday in early spring, a moving truck pulled up, and a woman got out of a blue sedan and stood on the porch and looked at the mountains like she was seeing them for the first time. Her name was Charlotte. I found that out the first day when she knocked on my door to ask if I knew anyone who could fix a cabinet door in her kitchen that wouldn't stay shut. She had brown hair pulled back in a loose knot, paint on the cuffs of her jeans, and a smile that looked tired but real. She was younger than me, maybe early 30s, and she carried herself like someone who'd learned to be careful in new places. She said she'd moved from the city, though she didn't say which one. She said she wanted somewhere quiet, and the way she said the word quiet told me she didn't just mean peaceful, she meant safe. I told her I could fix the cabinet myself. She looked surprised, then relieved, and she stepped back and gestured toward her house as if she was inviting me into a world she was still figuring out. I followed her across the driveway, Rufus trotting behind me, and I spent 20 minutes with a screwdriver and a level while she made coffee in a kitchen full of unpacked boxes. When I finished, she handed me a mug and said I should sit down for a minute, and I almost said no because I wasn't good at sitting still in other people's houses. But something about the way she stood there, holding that mug out like an offering, made me say yes. That coffee turned into a ritual. Every morning, one of us would cross the driveway to the other's porch, and we'd sit and talk about small things, like the weather, or the woodpecker that kept attacking her gutter like it owed him money, or her attempts to grow tomatoes in the clay soil that kept producing nothing but frustration. She'd laugh at my stories about the people in town, and her laugh was the kind that filled her whole face, eyes crinkling, head tipping back, and it made me feel like I was doing something right, just by being funny. I hadn't felt that in a long time. I noticed things about Charlotte that I tried not to notice. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking hard about something. The way she looked at the mountains every morning like they might disappear if she didn't pay attention. The way her voice got softer when she talked about the life she'd left behind, which wasn't often, and never in detail. I told myself the warmth I felt when she walked across the gravel was just the coffee, just the friendliness of having someone nearby after years of quiet. I told myself that because the alternative was admitting I felt something I wasn't ready to feel. But there were things I couldn't explain away. She flinched sometimes at loud noises, a car backfiring on the road, a thunderclap that shook the porch roof. And the flinch wasn't surprise. It was something deeper, something practiced. She checked her phone too often, her face going tight and careful when she looked at the screen, like she was bracing for something she hoped wouldn't come. I noticed she always kept the phone face down when we were talking, and she'd turn it over when she thought I wasn't looking, just to check, just to make sure. She never talked about why she left the city, and I never pushed because I recognized that kind of silence. I lived in it myself. One evening in late spring, she brought me a jar of jam she'd made from the blackberries that grew along the fence between our properties. She stood on my porch with the jar in both hands and the light going gold behind her, and she said, "You know, I'm glad I ended up next to you." I didn't know what to say, because I wasn't good at receiving things like that, words that meant more than they sounded like they meant. So I just nodded and said, "Me too." And I watched her walk back across the driveway with her bare feet on the gravel and her hair loose on her shoulders. I stood in my doorway long after she'd gone inside, and Rufus pressed against my leg and whined softly as if he could feel whatever was happening in my chest. Something had shifted that night, something I'd been refusing to let shift for months, and I didn't try to push it back because I didn't want to. Weeks passed, and the coffee ritual became the best part of my day, the thing I looked forward to before I even opened my eyes. I'd hear her screen door squeak across the driveway, and I'd put the kettle on, and by the time she knocked, I'd have 2 mugs ready. We'd sit on the porch and watch the fog burn off and talk about whatever came to mind, and it was the easiest thing I'd done in years, just being near her without having to be anyone other than who I was. The morning it happened was a Tuesday. The coffee was hot, and Rufus was asleep under the porch swing with his belly in the dirt and his ears twitching at nothing. Charlotte was talking about a book she was reading, something about a woman who drives across the country by herself, just her and the road and whatever she finds along the way. Her eyes were bright when she talked about it, brighter than I'd seen them in a while, and she was sitting forward in her chair with her elbows on her knees like a kid hearing a bedtime story. I said it without thinking, the words coming out of my mouth before my brain had a chance to catch them. "We should do that," I said. "Drive to the coast. Just get in the truck and go." I laughed right after I said it because it was ridiculous. I'm 40 years old, and I haven't done anything spontaneous since before Linda left. My idea of adventure is trying the hardware store 2 towns over instead of the one in town. I expected Charlotte to laugh too, to shake her head and say something about how we both have things to do, how the coast is 4 hours away, how it's a nice thought, but not a real one. But she didn't laugh. She looked at me, and the smile on her face changed into something I hadn't seen before, something serious and wide open. And she said, "Okay," fast and clear, one word before I'd even finished the sentence, before the word "go" had fully left my mouth. The silence after that single word was the loudest silence I'd ever heard on that porch. I stared at her, and she stared back at me, and neither of us blinked. I tried to backpedal, my mouth moving ahead of my brain again, this time in the wrong direction. I didn't really mean, it was just a thought. But she was already standing up, already setting her mug on the railing, already smiling in a way that made her whole face change. "When do we leave?" she said, and her voice was steady and certain, and it didn't match the joke I thought I'd made. I should have said never. I should have said it was just talk, that I wasn't serious, that the truck needs an oil change and Rufus can't be left alone that long, and I had a job to finish for the Hendersons by Friday. But something in her eyes, something raw and urgent that I'd never seen before, made me hear myself say, "Give me an hour." And the way her face lit up when I said it, like I'd given her something she'd been waiting for, made the decision feel right in a way I couldn't explain. The next hour was a blur of motion that didn't match my usual pace at all. I packed a cooler with sandwiches and bottles of water and a bag of pretzels. She changed into jeans and grabbed a jacket and a blanket from her hall closet. I fed Rufus and left extra food in his bowl and told him to be good, and he looked at me with those tired brown eyes like he knew something I didn't. She brought her phone with a playlist ready and a pair of sunglasses she perched on top of her head. We were in my truck by 9. The mountains were still wrapped in fog, the kind that sits in the valleys and doesn't burn off until mid-morning, and the air smelled like pine and wet earth. Charlotte was in the passenger seat with her feet tucked up and her knees pulled to her chest, looking out the windshield like the road ahead was a lifeline someone had thrown her. I turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life, the old diesel shaking the whole cab. I glanced at her, and she glanced back, and I thought I didn't know what I was doing, but I put the truck in gear, and I pulled out of the driveway, and the gravel crunched under the tires, and we were going. The first hour was careful. We talked about the scenery because it was safe and it was there, the mountains falling away behind us as we dropped in elevation, the road curving through gaps and hollows, the land opening up into rolling hills with old barns leaning in the fields like tired men who'd been standing too long. The sky got wider the further east we drove, and the trees thinned out, and the world felt like it was making room for something. Charlotte picked the music. She had a playlist on her phone, and she plugged it into the aux cord with the confidence of someone who'd been planning this soundtrack for a while. Old songs from Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles, and a folk singer I didn't recognize with a guitar and a voice like warm honey. She sang along quietly, under her breath, and I watched her from the corner of my eye while I drove, and I thought she looked younger when she sang. Younger and lighter. Like whatever she was carrying got a little less heavy for those few minutes. The talk got less careful as the miles passed. She asked about my woodworking, And I told her about the dining table I'd built for a couple in town, how the woman had cried when she saw the grain in the wood, the way the oak curled and rolled like water frozen mid-motion. I told her I didn't understand why people cried over furniture. She looked at me from the passenger seat and said, "Because you made it feel like it mattered." Something about the way she said it, quiet and certain, made my throat go tight, and I had to look at the road for a while. I told her I'd worked construction in my 20s, framing houses and pouring foundations, the kind of work that breaks your body down over time until your hands stop closing all the way. I switched to woodworking because I wanted to build things that lasted, things that people would touch every day, and maybe think about the hands that made them. She said that was beautiful, and I told her it was just wood and nails, and she laughed and said I was allowed to call my own work beautiful without it meaning anything more than that. I asked her what she did in the city, and she said she was a graphic designer. She said it like it was 100 miles behind her, like the person who did that work was someone she used to know but didn't talk to anymore. She didn't offer more, and I didn't push, because I knew what it felt like to have parts of your life that you're not ready to open up about. We stopped at a gas station about 2 hours in, a small place with 2 pumps and a rack of sunflower seeds by the register. She bought coffee and a bag of pretzels while I filled the tank and checked the oil, because the truck really did need it, and I'd been telling the truth about that. When I came back from paying, she was standing by the truck with her phone in her hand, staring at the screen. Her face was different, tight and closed off, like a door I'd been watching open slowly all morning had just slammed shut. She put the phone away fast when she saw me walking toward her, sliding it into her jacket pocket with a quick, practiced motion, but not fast enough for me to miss the way her shoulders had climbed toward her ears. Back on the road, she was quieter. The singing stopped. She looked out the window at the fields rolling past, and I wanted to ask her what she'd seen on that screen, what had made her face go hard like that. But I'd spent 3 years learning not to ask, not to push, not to reach for things that might pull away. I'd learned that from Linda, from the way asking too many questions made her feel trapped, and I'd turned it into a rule I lived by. So I reached for the radio instead, and I found a station playing something slow and warm, and I turned it up just enough to fill the silence. After a while, Charlotte's hand drifted to the center console between our seats. Her fingers rested there, relaxed, an inch from mine. I didn't move my hand, and she didn't move hers, and that inch felt like the widest space in the world. Like everything I wanted to say and everything she wasn't saying lived in that gap, and neither of us was brave enough to close it. We were somewhere in the middle of Virginia when it happened. The land had flattened out, the mountains long gone behind us, and the fields stretched to the horizon in every direction like the earth had been ironed smooth. Charlotte's phone buzzed on the dashboard. She ignored it. I glanced at her, and she glanced at the phone and then away, quick, like it was a hot stove she'd accidentally touched. It buzzed again, and then again, 3 times in a row, the screen lighting up each time with a name I couldn't read from my angle, but could see was there. A name she didn't say out loud. Her shoulders went up toward her ears, and her jaw set, and her hands folded in her lap. And I watched all of this from the corner of my eye while I kept the truck steady on the road. She turned it off, not silenced, but completely off, and the screen went black as she opened the glove compartment and put it inside and closed it as though she were closing a door on something she didn't want to let in. The quiet in the truck changed after that. It wasn't comfortable anymore, the easy silence of 2 people who'd found a rhythm. It was loaded, full of everything she wasn't saying, full of the shape of whatever was on that phone. I didn't ask, though the wanting sat in my chest like a stone. But I said, quiet and careful, "You don't have to go to the coast with me. If you need to handle something, we can turn around." She cut me off before I finished the sentence, the same way she'd cut me off with "okay" that morning. "There's nothing to handle," she said. "That's why I'm here." She said the word here like it meant more than the truck, more than the highway, more than the coast ahead. Like here meant next to me, like here meant away from whatever was on that screen. I nodded, and I turned the radio up, and we drove in a silence that wasn't empty, but full. Full of everything she was carrying and everything I was afraid to ask about. Full of the distance between us that had nothing to do with the inch on the console and everything to do with the parts of ourselves we were still hiding. An hour later, the air changed. I rolled my window down a crack, and there it was, faint but unmistakable. Salt. The trees had thinned out to scrub pine, and the fields had given way to marshland, low and green and wet, with herons standing in the shallows like they were meditating. Charlotte's whole body shifted. She uncurled from her seat, pulled her feet down from under her, and leaned forward against the dashboard. She breathed in deep through her nose, slow and deliberate, like she'd been holding her breath for 100 miles and was finally letting herself exhale. I asked her, quiet, the words careful in my mouth. "You want to tell me what happened in the city?" And this time, she didn't deflect. She didn't smile and change the subject. She looked at the marshland rolling past, and she told me. His name was Marcus. She said it carefully, like the name itself was something breakable that she'd been carrying too long. Marcus was her boyfriend for 4 years. He was charming when she first met him, funny and attentive, the kind of man who remembers your coffee order and opens doors and makes you feel like the center of something. But somewhere in the second year, the charm curdled. He didn't hit her, she said, and she said it like she needed me to know that, like she needed to draw a line between what happened to her and what happens in darker rooms. But he made her small. He checked her phone every night. He told her which of her friends she could see and which ones she couldn't. He said things that didn't leave bruises, but left her wondering if she was the problem, if she was crazy, if maybe the reason he was always angry was because she wasn't doing something right. She tried to leave twice. The first time, he cried and promised he'd change, and she believed him, because she wanted so badly to believe that love could fix things, that being patient enough and kind enough would be enough. The second time, she got as far as the parking lot of her apartment building with a bag in her hand before he called and talked her back inside, his voice warm and sorry and familiar. She went because the version of him on the phone sounded like the man she'd fallen in love with, and she couldn't let go of that man, even though he wasn't real anymore. The third time, she didn't tell him. She packed her car on a Sunday while he was at work, every box loaded in silence, every drawer emptied, with the care of someone who knew she had one chance. She drove until the city was behind her, until the buildings gave way to trees, and the trees gave way to mountains, and she kept driving until she found a town small enough that he'd never think to look for her there. That's how she ended up in the Blue Ridge, in the house across from my driveway, with her paint-stained jeans and her tired smile and her coffee every morning. She said she'd been there 5 months. She said the phone call started 3 weeks ago. He found her, and she didn't know how, whether it was social media or a mutual friend or some digital trail she'd forgotten to cover. He called, and she didn't answer, but she couldn't bring herself to change the number because part of her was still afraid that if she cut the cord completely, if she made it final and irreversible, he'd show up at her door instead of just on her phone. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, and I didn't say anything for a long time. The marshland rolled past the windows, green and flat and endless, and a heron stood in a creek not 20 feet from the road, still as a statue, watching us go. I thought about Charlotte on her porch every morning, laughing at my stories, tucking her hair behind her ear, and I thought about the phone she checked too often, and the flinching at loud noises, and the way she said she wanted somewhere quiet. All of it made sense now, every piece clicking into place like joints in a well-built table. Then I said, "You're safe. You know that, right?" Charlotte looked at me, and her eyes were wet, and she said, "I know. That's why I said okay so fast." The words landed in my chest like a hammer on fresh wood. She said yes because she felt safe with me. She said yes because the road trip meant getting farther away from the phone and the calls and the shadow of a man who'd spent 4 years making her small. And she said yes because she wanted one day where she wasn't afraid. One day where she could breathe the way she was breathing right now, with the salt air coming through the cracked window and the marshland stretching to the horizon, and no phone buzzing on the dashboard. I looked at the road, and I swallowed hard, and I said, "Then that's what today is." She nodded, and she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and she reached over and rested her hand on the console. This time, I moved mine to meet it. We crossed a long bridge over open water, and the ocean spread out in front of us like the edge of the world. Charlotte pressed her hand flat against the passenger window, and her mouth opened slightly, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. She just looked at the blue and vast and endless water catching the afternoon sun and throwing it back in a million pieces. I watched her face and I thought, this is what she needed. Not the coast, but the space, the room to be someone who isn't looking over her shoulder. We found a beach with almost no one on it, a stretch of sand and dunes about a mile south of a fishing pier. I parked the truck under a scraggly pine and turned the engine off, and the silence was sudden and total. Just the sound of waves and the wind in the seagrass. Charlotte was out the door before I'd even pulled the key from the ignition, her shoes already in her hand, walking toward the water with her feet bare on the sand and her hair lifting off her shoulders in the salt breeze. I followed her. The sand was cool and soft under my boots, and the wind picked up as we got closer to the water, steady and warm, carrying the smell of salt and seaweed and something clean and ancient that I couldn't name. The waves were low and regular, rolling in like breathing, one after another, patient and unhurried. And the sound of them was the most peaceful thing I'd heard in years. There were gulls overhead, white against the blue, calling to each other in voices that sounded like questions I didn't need to answer. Charlotte walked to the edge of the water and stopped. The surf touched her feet, and she laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind I'd heard on the porch, but never this loud, never this free. She turned around in the shallow water, her jeans rolled to her knees, and she spread her arms wide and tilted her face up to the sun. I stood a few feet behind her, watching, and I realized something I'd been refusing to let myself know. I was in love with her. And I'm not talking about the slow warmth I'd been pretending was just neighborly feeling, or the comfort of having someone to drink coffee with in the morning. This was love, the kind that arrives quietly, morning by morning, coffee by coffee. And then one day, you're standing on a beach watching her stand in the surf, and you can't imagine the porch without her in the other chair. You can't imagine the house without her light on across the driveway. You can't imagine going back to the quiet and the solitude and the routine, because the routine now has her in it. And without her, it's just going through the motions. She turned around and caught me looking, and she didn't look away. The smile softened into something else, something careful and warm, and a little scared. And I recognized that look because I'd felt it on my own face 100 times. She walked back to me through the shallow water, her feet leaving prints in the wet sand that the waves filled in behind her. She stopped close enough that I could see the salt water on her eyelashes, and the freckles the sun had drawn across her nose, and the way her breath was coming a little faster than it should have from just walking. She said, "Thank you for bringing me here." And I said, "I'm glad you said okay." She laughed again, soft this time, a breath of a laugh, and she lifted her face toward mine. I almost did it. I almost closed the distance. My heart was going so fast I could feel it in my throat, in my wrists, in the spaces between my ribs. She was right there, her face tipped up toward mine, her eyes half closed, and every part of me wanted to lean in and let whatever I'd been holding back finally go. But something stopped me. The old fear, the one that lives in the place where Linda's suitcase used to sit. The voice that says, "You're 40 and alone, and there's a reason for that." The voice that says, if you reach for something good, it'll turn out you were right all along, that you're not enough, that the quiet is what you deserve because it's all you can hold on to without breaking. I pulled back, not far, but enough to break the moment, and I saw something flicker in Charlotte's eyes. It wasn't hurt, and it wasn't anger, but recognition. Like she knew exactly what had just happened and why I stopped. Because she'd spent 4 years with a man who reached for her when he wanted something and pulled back when he didn't. And she could read the shape of a man's retreat better than anyone. She didn't say anything. She turned back toward the water, and the distance between us, which had been an inch on the console and nothing at all a moment ago, was now a few feet of sand and a lifetime of silence. The sun was dropping toward the water by the time we sat down. Charlotte had brought the blanket from her hall closet, and she spread it on the sand above the tide line, and we sat side by side, not touching, with the waves doing their steady work in front of us. The light had gone gold and amber, the kind of light that makes everything look like a memory, even while it's still happening. And the air was cooling fast, the way it does near the water when the sun starts to go. Charlotte hadn't spoken since the almost kiss. She was looking at the horizon with her arms wrapped around her knees and her chin resting on her forearms. I sat beside her with my hands in my lap and my chest full of something I couldn't name. And I knew that if I didn't say something now, if I let the silence win the way I'd been letting it win for 3 years, I'd lose her. And not to Marcus or to the city, but to my own fear. I said, "I almost kissed you." And it wasn't a question or an apology, just a fact laid on the sand between us like a piece of wood I'd cut and was waiting to see if it fit. Charlotte didn't look at me. She said, "I know." Then, quieter, "Why didn't you?" I told her about Linda, about the suitcase on the Thursday afternoon and the note on the counter and the car gone from the driveway. I told her about the 6 months of silence before the divorce papers came and how I'd spent 3 years telling myself that I wasn't enough, that the quiet was my fault, that if I'd been different or better or more, she would have stayed. I told her that the fear of reaching for something good and watching it pull away had become the loudest voice in my head, louder than the radio, louder than the coffee ritual, louder than the slow thaw I'd been feeling on the porch every morning. I said, "I'm afraid that if I reach for something good, it'll turn out I was right, that I'm not enough." Charlotte was quiet for a long time. The sun was half in the water now, sending a line of gold across the surface that looked like a road to somewhere. Then she turned to me, and her eyes were steady and clear, and she said, "You fixed my cabinet door. You sat with me on the porch every morning for 5 months and never once asked me a question I wasn't ready to answer. You drove 4 hours because I said one word." She reached over and took my hand. Her fingers were cold from the wind, and mine were warm from sitting in the sun, and she held on tight, her grip firm and certain. "You are enough," she said. "You've been enough this whole time. I just needed you to see it." Something broke open inside me. Not painfully, not like a wall coming down, but more like a window that's been painted shut for years, finally being pushed open. Light and air rushed in, and I could breathe, really breathe, for the first time in longer than I could remember. I turned my hand and laced my fingers through hers, and I held on, and the ocean filled the silence, and for the first time in 3 years, the quiet didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like peace. We stayed on that beach until the sun was gone and the stars came out over the water, thick and bright the way they never are in town. Charlotte leaned against my shoulder, and I put my arm around her, and the waves kept their steady rhythm, and I thought I could sit here forever in this exact spot, with her weight against my shoulder, and the salt air on my face, and the stars scattered across the sky like someone had thrown a handful of sand at the dark. But eventually, we had to go. The drive back was different in every way that mattered. The truck was the same old diesel with the same rattle in the dashboard and the same pull to the left on straight roads, but everything else had changed. Charlotte didn't tuck her feet up the way she had on the drive down. She sat close to me, her shoulder against mine, her hand resting on my leg. The radio played something soft, and she hummed along, and the silence between songs wasn't loaded anymore. It was warm. She said, "I'm going to change my number," and her voice was certain, not tentative or questioning, the way she'd said okay that morning, like something had unlocked when she told me the truth, and she was done being afraid. I said, "Good." And then, because one word wasn't enough to carry everything I meant, I said, "And if he shows up, you come to me." She looked at me in the dark of the truck cab, her eyes catching the glow of the dashboard, and she nodded. She didn't cry. She just held my hand a little tighter. I drove through the dark, and the mountains rose up around us again as the road climbed, the trees closing in, the curves getting tighter. I felt something I hadn't felt in years, something I'd almost forgotten was possible. I felt like the future wasn't just something that happened to me. I felt like it was something I was driving toward. At some point, Charlotte fell asleep with her head against the window, and her breathing slow and even, and her hand still resting on my leg. I turned the radio down, and I glanced at her in the dim light, and I thought about how something in me had been opening, an inch at a time, morning by morning, coffee by coffee. And now it was wide open, and the air coming through was cold and clean and alive. We pulled into the driveway at midnight. The porch light was on, the one I always left on, even when I was home alone, because the dark felt different after Linda left. Rufus was asleep on the swing with his nose tucked under his paw, and he lifted his head and thumped his tail once when he heard the truck. Charlotte woke up and blinked at the mountains, dark shapes against the stars, and she looked at me, and I looked at her. She leaned over and kissed me. It was soft and slow, a kiss that tasted like salt air and something sweeter, something that felt like a promise I didn't have words for yet. When she pulled back, she smiled, and the smile was tired and real, and it filled her whole face. "Good night, Bill," she said. She opened the door and walked across the gravel to her house with her bare feet sure on the stones, and she turned once at her porch and waved. Then she was inside, and the light came on in her kitchen window, warm and yellow in the dark. I stood in my driveway for a long time after that. The mountains were dark shapes against the stars, and Rufus was wagging his tail on the porch, and the night air smelled like pine and something else, something that might have been the salt still in my clothes. The house that used to feel like an empty room was just a house again, because the thing that had been missing was never inside it. It was across the driveway, in a kitchen with the light on, and I could see it from where I stood. Charlotte changed her number the next morning. Marcus never showed up, and every Tuesday since, we pick a direction and drive. If you've ever been one word away from changing your whole life, you know how it feels.